That's the funny part is like, I came out of Pearl and like the one thing that
You're
I
like,
took
I'm
away.
done engineering now.
Actually, the opposite. So I came out of Pearl and I was like, that was a crazy roller coaster. I want to do it again.
Wow, true. I guess that's the other way to look at it. Today I'm speaking with Chrissy Meyer, who discovered electrical engineering at age 9 and never looked back. Now a partner at Root Ventures, she helps provide initial funding for companies tackling new and complex technical projects. We'll talk about how the time she spent at Apple developing iconic products like the iPod Touch and the Apple Watch helped her develop the skill of building hardware that she can scale, about her life-changing decision to drop everything and move to Santa Cruz in 2014 to work at a vehicle hardware startup, and about how she and 4 other engineers run Root Ventures. Plus, some pro tips for you engineers out there who have trouble getting excited about the non-technical sides of starting a company. We live in a time where design and technology touch every aspect of our lives. But where did it all come from? Who designed it? How is it built and brought to market? What will it look like in a year, 2 years, 100 years? From the phones and smartwatches that help us in our day-to-day to the cutting-edge spaceships and 3D printers that are leading us into the future, modern design is constantly shaping the way we work, communicate, problem solve, and play. And every new design, big or small, starts with an idea and a bill of materials. I'm Magenta Strongheart, and this is The Bomb, where we talk to leading innovators in the tech world and celebrate the transformational power of design. Thank you so much, Chrissy, for joining us today, and welcome to The Bomb.
Oh, my pleasure. Super excited to be here.
Yeah, we're really excited to learn more about Root Ventures and really dive into your background, because I love that you have, I think, a very interesting story and kind of entry into venture capital coming from a really more traditional engineering and design for manufacture kind of background. Mm-hmm. So maybe we can just start there and learn more about kind of how you got into the hardware space.
Yeah. So I'd say that like it all started out when I was 9 years old. So as a 9-year-old, some old college buddies of my dad came and visited for Christmas, and they brought me one of these, like, I don't know if you remember the like build your own radio kits from Radio Shack, where you like kidnap
RIP Radio Shack. They were the best.
I know. And I just like fell in love with this thing, and I decided then and there at like the age of 9 that I wanted to be an electrical engineer. And I don't think I've ever met a 9-year-old with as much conviction as I had about like electrical engineering. And the funny thing is, like, I never deviated. Like I stuck to that, and like I was really passionate about it like all through high school and college. So I went to like a small undergrad only engineering school in the middle of nowhere in Indiana. Okay. Got my undergrad degree in EE, moved to Boston for a couple years right after school, where I worked on military satellites. And I like very quickly learned that although the technical work was really cool and super exciting, like government projects can be pretty slow. So I went back to school, came out here to Stanford, never intended to settle permanently in California.
Famous last words.
I grew up in Kentucky and thought that I would eventually move back east, but fell in love with like everything out here. Ended up dropping out of a PhD program at Stanford and going to Apple. And this was like, I'd say like my first week at Apple was 2006, and it was like the week that they launched the first iPhone.
Wow.
So it was a crazy time. And like coming out of school, and that particular week we called them beer bashes. There was like a beer bash every week. It was like nonstop party, like day after day. And like being a grad student coming into that environment, I'm like, this is amazing.
Yeah, you're like, what kind of workplace environment is this?
This is too good to be true. Like free beer. Oh my gosh. So I ended up spending like 6 or 7 years at Apple, and Apple just like, it hooked me on building things. Like it like made me fall in love with building hardware. And not just building hardware, but like building hardware with an eye towards scaling. Because if you're going to build one of something or 100 of something or 1,000 of something, or if you're going to build tens of millions of something, you would design it totally different from the very, very beginning.
Yeah.
And that time at Apple, like there was no one else in the world that kind of was able to do what they did in terms of how quickly they could scale products. So I came in and like I joined on the engineering program management side and shipped, I think, 4 iPod Touches, 1 iPod Nano, and then I did a bunch of led all the exploratory design work for the first Apple Watch.
Wow. Such an iconic time.
Yeah,
you were there, period. Yeah.
It was wild. And I say I worked on iPods, and I guess that's not cool and exciting and sexy anymore. People don't even remember.
I mean, they hold like a sweet place in my, my growing up, and like getting a new iPod for Christmas was always like such, what you look forward to every year. So
well, now I feel like I'm dating myself. When I say I worked on iPods, people are like, you were that old?
No, I think, like I said, it's probably considered for a lot of people who enjoyed those products like a very kind of like iconic time for Apple, products and releases. I mean, I feel like, I don't know, I guess as much if people like wait outside the doors of Apple in long lines anymore for releases, but I feel like they do. Okay, I'm not as in the loop with that, but I'm like, ooh. But for iPods, I feel like that was such a huge thing, know, and the first rounds of some of the iPhones and stuff for sure. Yeah. What would you say? So you mentioned, there were like some key differences in designing for hundreds and thousands versus millions. Can you, if you can, summarize any of those key differences? I think our audience would be really interested.
Yeah, totally. I mean, well, first of all, like you're designing for it to be manufactured in a factory from day one. So the idea of doing like a couple of prototypes at your desk, like that's not really an option. Like you're immediately going into factories. Most of them at my time, like were in southern China. So when I say I spent like time at Apple, the reality is I spent the vast majority of my time like in factories in southern China. Wow. Yeah. And like months at a time too, trying to bring up lines, because even if you were building 100 of something, you had to make sure that it was like producible and assemblable without any like, really complicated maneuvers or really like difficult,
repeatable.
It had to be super easy to manufacture and repeatable. But then the other thing is like, you have to realize that, if you have, I'd say like 1 in a million batteries exploding, well, if you're shipping 40 million of something or 50 million of something, that's a big problem. Like you got to fix that. Like that's not acceptable.
Not gonna work.
Though we would like never use the words. You can't use the words like fire or explosion. Like you have to. I think what do we like thermal event? Okay, is the like politically correct term,
the technical term.
Yeah, the technical term to use. But it's the idea that like 1 in a million failures, you actually have to figure out if you have those early, and then design them out or design protections in there like to protect against those, because they could turn into a very big deal. And there just aren't that many companies in the world that manufacture at that scale and that volume that you actually care about 1 in a million failures.
Of course.
So it's a different level of engineering that I'd say is like trains you to be hyper detail oriented and have multiple like redundancies in like everything that you do and every part that you source. There were no several examples of components that you couldn't single source from one vendor, because there's no vendor in the world that can, machine enough enclosures to like meet the volumes that you need. So there were some parts on our BOM that we would have to have 5, 6, 7 different suppliers for, which means 5, 7, 6, 7 different suppliers that you're qualifying, that you're managing, that you're calling every week and trying to stay on top of and make sure that they work through their issues. So it was an exciting time to be there, but it was also intense.
Yeah,
it was
I can imagine. Intense. Definitely. Do you have any memories of working under Steve Jobs? I'm so curious. I was like, now that I think about that era also, I'm sure people ask you that.
Yeah.
But.
Well, I'd say like probably the thing that was the biggest like thorn in my side is that when we would do prototype builds in China, like we would always want to pick like the best unit and like rapidly take it back to the US for, what do we call it? We called them like exec units, which it was basically for like Steve and like the upper level execs to look at. And those units we would always cherry pick. It would be like the best and the best. So we would spend hours. I mean, hours, like just picking the trying to find like looking at every little gap, every little gap and offset and every little like ding and scratch. And we would also make sure that they like went through all the test stations and that like the microphone performance and the speaker performance, that everything was like best in class. So just the amount of like time that we would spend in China.
Just preparing the prototype for.
Yeah, being awake at 1 a.m. being like, oh, is that a little ding there? Like we can't send that one back, you know?
Oh man. So. Intense, like you said.
Intense, but it was a good like intro to like high volume consumer electronics. And like going back to my story, I then left Apple and went to Square to work on credit card reader hardware. And it was a totally different beast because now all of a sudden I was learning how to build hardware that we were effectively giving away for free. You know, we weren't charging anything to the merchants to send them a little credit card reader. So cost mattered a lot, but it was also B2B hardware. It was like we weren't selling to end consumers, and it wasn't the type of volumes that I was used to at Apple. So it was a totally different beast, but challenging in its own way.
Yeah. And when you started at Square, how kind of established were they when you first got there?
They were still pretty early. I want to say it was 200 or 300 people total.
So I'd imagine that's a huge difference too from going to a pretty, huge company.
Yeah.
They have all their kind of processes in place and their contacts and their standards.
Yes.
Did you get the opportunity to kind of set that up at Square?
Yeah. But the nice thing about when I came into Square is I think we had like 10 or 15 people on the hardware team at that time. And a good chunk of them were from Apple. So it was like a lot of the core Apple DNA was brought over. So it was, even though
sorry to interrupt, but was Square founded by like ex-Apple team members?
No, not at all. But one of the early hardware, the guy that like ran the early hardware team, he did come over from the Apple accessories team. So it was still a bunch of people from Apple, which was nice because it's like, yes, we have different constraints. We have different cost targets. We have different sets of suppliers, but at the same time, like the core team had an idea. Like we were just, even though we had never worked together before, like we were all operating under the same processes. We cared about the same things. We approached product development from the same way. And I think that made things a lot easier because the team just kind of gelled and could kind of jive from day one. But it was amazing to see, like the funny thing about me going to Square is that it was the first time in my life I had ever worked at a company where like hardware wasn't the primary thing. It wasn't like the end all and be all. And it opened my eyes to this world, this whole world of like software and software development. And it's just like, oh my gosh, like hardware is a piece of this, but so much of what the suite of products that Square was building out, and like 98% of their company was on the software development side. So it gave me a lot of exposure to that, which I think was something I didn't get a lot of at Apple, frankly.
And how the hardware can really support that mission and the whole user experience.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay. So then after Square, where did you go?
So I left Square. It was a pretty short stint at Square, but after Square, some of my friends from Apple called me up, and I remember it distinctly because they were like, okay, Chrissy, we're starting a company. We want you in. We don't have an office. We can't pay you. We don't know what we're building, but like, we know we're going to do this. And honestly, like if you looked back at it, it was probably the top, like, 4 or 5 people that I'd ever worked with like over the course of my entire career. So all of those things were almost irrelevant. I was like, yep,
I'm sold on you guys.
I'm in. So the funny thing is, like, we took a big leap of faith because my husband quit his job at the time. I quit my job at the time, and we both moved down to Santa Cruz to work on this startup together. And we were like all in from day one. And it was called Pearl Automation, and we were building vehicle technology products. So think like backup cameras, blind spot warnings, aftermarket products that could be put onto like any vehicle.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Ended up not working out. Like we ended up raising a decent chunk of money, growing the team to about 80 or 90 people. And then like the whole thing started to unravel, never achieved product market fit, and shut the whole thing down after a few years. So it was this crazy roller coaster of like really exciting, like I don't know if we're going to make it. And then we'd raise another round and like get another infusion of capital and be like really excited about growing the team and scaling and then, you know, ultimately shutting it down. So I think that like living through that has given me now a lot of empathy for founders because I know like the emotional journey.
I was going to say, like, what would you say were your kind of top 2 lessons learned from that experience that you feel like you apply to a lot of the conversations and teams you're supporting now?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think the first one is just like really figuring out what the formula is to determine whether or not you have product market fit. Like
having that be like the first priority.
I think that coming from Apple, like it's core to your Apple DNA that like you keep everything quiet. Like everything is like really, really under wraps. Everything is secretive. You don't want to let it out there what you're working on because somebody might copy you and get to market first. And I think that there was a little bit of like core Apple DNA in our team and like what we were doing. And I think we should have been out there talking to more people. And I think we should have been out there like, and I think that that's some of the things that like with my current startups, it's like, okay, like what can we do to prove or disprove the value that we're bringing to customers now? And what can we do to prove or disprove how much value we're bringing to our customers with the next feature we release and the next feature we release and the next feature we release, and trying to de-risk some of that as early as possible before you grow a team, before you bring on additional capital. And I think that's probably one of the big takeaways.
That's really interesting because I think at all stages of designing, product development, going into business and wanting to start their own business, depending on, you know, what it is, if it's around technology or hardware, software, product or B2B, like the amount of sharing in today's world, like what is appropriate, what's going to be advantageous versus what can ruin, you know, what you're working on. And it sounds like, I mean, I think there's probably no, you know, general rule of thumb that it's probably very case by case, but do you have any specific anecdotes or like ways that you kind of walk your teams through to understand what should they be kind of putting out there, or even in a limited scope, you know, if it's just to some user testers versus to other investors, or to actually, you know, sharing on social media or whatever it might be as a marketing tool, kind of how do you navigate?
I've actually like swung pretty dramatically in the opposite direction of like encouraging our companies to like share more sooner, like
put it all out there.
Put it all out there, because the reality of it is you're always going to have detractors. You're always going to have people that like are haters that say, oh, I would never use that, or oh, like, you know, that would never work for me. But then like even those people, you can extract so much value.
Yeah, you can still learn
from like, you know, how do you segment them? Like, why are they saying that they would never try your product? Like, and then like just the sheer amount of like, it just helps you segment your customer base a little bit more. And I think that you can get a lot of information out of that too. So it's like now I think like putting things out there as soon as you can gets you as much data and as much information that will allow you to refine your product.
Absolutely. Okay, so you said product market fit was one of the lessons you learned from the experience with Pro Automation. What would you say is kind of the second big takeaway that you carry on to your work that you do now?
Yeah, just the value in staying like lean and scrappy. So I think at that time, like keep in mind that we were operating in a space where a new autonomous vehicle company was popping up like every 6 months.
Can you tell us kind of what year Pro Automation, what that was happening?
We started back in 2014.
Okay.
So that was like the peak of the like autonomous vehicle bubble. So it's like when companies were going out and raising huge sums of money from big name investors with the promise that like autonomous vehicles are like 3 years in the future. And I think a little bit of that hype cycle got a bunch of companies of that era like way too far ahead of their skis, and making promises that like
no one could keep,
that were technically impossible. So I think that like, you know, you can look at that whole era and see what happened and see how many companies, you know, blew up and exploded and you know, ended up ultimately going under. And you can kind of look back and be like, okay, well, just because you can take more capital right now doesn't mean that you should.
Yeah.
Like, just because you've got investors trying to throw money at you doesn't mean that you should take it. And I think that fast forward to 2021 and like the crazy cycle of investment that we saw happening in 2021, a lot of people learned that the hard way again, right? It's like we have a lot of companies that went out during that era and raised huge sums of money and outrageous valuations with very little to prove, like with very little to demonstrate product market fit or very little revenue. And the fortunate thing is a lot of them now have a big bank account. So they've got a lot of time to like grow into that valuation.
To catch up.
but I think that a lot of them will ultimately, like a lot of companies in tech and startups in tech will struggle and like may not be able to grow into that valuation because they've gotten a little bit too far ahead of their skis. So I think there's like just this value in staying lean and scrappy until you've proven, until you know in your heart of hearts that like you have a product that people want and you're ready to scale it.
Makes sense. And you're inspiring me. Like we need to do maybe a segment on kind of those early, well, not early, but like you said, kind of the autonomous vehicle bubble. Yes. We should do a kind of like deep dive on that because on, what kind of succeeded, what failed, I think would be really interesting, especially in this time when it's so much, technology is progressing right now in that space. And we're doing kind of a lot of interviews. I think I mentioned when I reached out to you, wanting to get in touch with some of the companies that Root's working with in the autonomous vehicle space, because that's kind of one of our themes for this season. But it'd be really interesting to go back and kind of see, what was kind of ahead of its time or didn't, like you said, really have the backing to keep up with their investment. I think it's really interesting.
But the amazing thing is like so much came out of that period, even if like the future of fully autonomous vehicles wasn't right around the corner as everybody had promised. So much came out.
Do you think it helped expedite a lot of what's happening today?
I mean, look at just like case in point, LiDAR technology. Like look at how much that has been expedited just because of the capital that went into the AV space. And look at like now all of the new use cases and like places where it's being adopted and like industrial robotics and like things, entire industries have moved forward by decades because of some of the core technologies that were developed out of the AV wars. So like that's to me as an investor, like that's the exciting part. It's like, oh my gosh, like regardless of what happened to the autonomous vehicles, like, oh my gosh, the tech that came out of this,
transferable tech.
The tech that came out of this is amazing. It's like is applicable to so many different areas.
Definitely. Okay, so then back to Chrissy's journey.
Oh yeah.
So after Pearl Automation, did you go directly into investing?
Yeah. So that's the funny part is like I came out of Pearl and like the one thing that I took away.
I'm done engineering now.
Actually, the opposite. So I came out of Pearl and I was like, that was a crazy roller coaster. I want to do it again.
Wow, true. I guess that's the other way to look at it.
It's like I loved it. I loved the thrill of it. I loved everything about it, and I just like fell in love with early stage startups, and just like was so jazzed by it that I knew that I was either going to start something myself or I was going to join another like really, really early stage kind of inception level company. The thought of like being an investor never crossed my mind, like never once crossed my mind. So I was out there trying to figure out like, okay, what do I want to do? Like take a little bit of time off. What company do I want to join? Maybe I should consult with some startups like while I'm like just kind of shopping around. And that's when I met Kane and Avidan, who are my partners now at Root Ventures. And I had a few conversations with them and we were mainly talking about their portfolio companies and they invested in a lot of hardware at that time, and my background was in hardware, so we kind of hit it off. I forget how many conversations we got in, but then they were like, "Have you ever thought about becoming a VC? Have you ever thought about like giving investing a try?" And like my gut reaction was like, "Oh man, no." Like I've never taken a finance class. I've never taken a business class. Like I'm an engineer's engineer. Like that's not like investing is not my thing. And their response to me was like, yeah, but those are the easy parts to learn.
That's so interesting because I'm sure that's what a lot of people think is like, I can never get into investing because I don't have really the like financial background or something, you know, or understanding, kind of that business side of things. Yeah. So
and like their whole reaction was just like the engineering, like that's the part that we can't teach. Assessing technical risk and looking at a team and looking at a product and looking at a bomb and a roadmap and like being able to call bullshit or like not like that is the part that's the hard part. And like that is the stuff that I already had and like got most excited about. So I ended up joining them. And this was right around the time, it was the end of our first fund, the beginning of our second fund. And like within like, a few months, I had just fallen in love with investing. Like it is
plot twist.
Yeah, it was, and I knew that like I knew that it would be really, really hard for me to turn around and go back to an operating role because I just like fell head over heels and in love with like the work and just the exposure. Like you're getting a front row seat to the future.
Yeah.
And there's something really exciting about that.
Yeah. Like you mentioned, kind of just the technology that's coming out of these companies and getting to, kind of be front row in those discoveries and where all of that's going. It's got to be so exciting. That's awesome. And so I think this is a great segue into what is kind of the elevator pitch for Root Ventures.
Yeah. A nice way of asking like what exactly do you do? I don't know. But I mean, I like to start out by giving a little bit of context, which is that like we're a team of 5 investors. And every single one of us has an engineering degree. Like we are all engineers and we like funding other engineers who are working on like really, really hard technical problems. And then to back up a second, like I like to segment like working on hard technical problems can mean a lot of different things, but I kind of segment it into 2 broad categories. One is teams that are building really technical products. And then the other is people that are building products for really technical teams. So to give a couple of examples, it's like really technical products. That could be pure software. That could be hardware. That could be biology, chemistry. Any of these things in any of these categories, you find people building really technical products. But we've invested in Wild Type, which is a company that is growing salmon from stem cells. So like being able to eat fish without ever killing a fish.
Not what you would expect when you think like hardware VC.
No, not at all. But very technical product.
Absolutely.
I've invested in a company called Oma Fertility, and they're actually using computer vision and AI to improve success rates in IVF treatments. Wow. So again, a really technical team working on a really technical product. And then the second broad category of products for technical teams, my partner Lee Edwards, he has a software engineering background and he has like done a tremendous amount of work in the software developer tool space. So a lot of his investments have been software developer tools. Similarly, like coming from a hardware background, I realize how bad the state of the art is in hardware. And I've done 2 investments so far and always looking to do more that are like what I call hardware developer tools.
We were just talking to Valentina at Allspice.
Oh yeah. So. and Valentina's amazing. And like Allspice is building like the GitHub for hardware that understands and interprets native EE file formats. Yep. And then we've also done another one called Quilter that is basically generative AI for printed circuit boards and doing printed circuit board layouts. So it's tools like that have a really technical customer, but there's been such a like dearth of like good tools in that space that it's exciting for me to like dig in and invest in those areas.
Definitely. No, that was a great kind of overview of all the different types of companies that you guys work with. And honestly, I'm like, it's great because we're ahead of schedule. Now you've covered some of the questions I was going to ask you later.
Sweet.
No problem, just built in. But you brought up that when you joined, you guys were just closing your second fund, it sounded like. So, and you guys just announced middle of last year that you closed your third fund. So could you walk us through kind of the differences in the previous funds and the current one you're in now, the third one, what you guys are kind of focusing on? If there's any difference, which I think there was when I was doing a little bit of research. And then I'd love to move on into some of the specific companies that you guys are supporting and ask more questions.
I'll start out by saying like fund 3, mo money, mo problems. Really bad.
That's the name of the episode.
90s hip hop joke. But no, I mean, the truth is like our third fund is a $150 million fund.
Wow.
Which is twice. Thank you. It's twice the size of our second fund. And with that, we've really doubled down on our like core thesis, which is like really hard tech, but at the same time, it's allowed us to write bigger checks in day one of like funding a company. So now we're writing $2 to $3 million checks, which allows us to have a really concentrated position and really concentrated portfolio, which allows us to like lean in and spend more time with the companies that we invest in. So a lot of the similar thesis to the types of investments we were doing in fund two. But at the same time, like we're just really, it's the opposite of what people call a spray and pray approach, where you write a lot of little checks into a bunch of companies and hope that one of them pans out. We kind of take the opposite approach, where we do a total of 6 to 8 investments a year, and that's it. But then we really lean in and help those companies with hiring, with recruiting, with high-level sales strategies and customer introductions. And I've done full bomb scrubs and like costed bombs for our portfolio companies before. You know, we really get into the weeds and we really get into the details to make sure that like they're set up for success.
That's huge.
But then the other difference is like it's been fun to watch like the evolution of Root since I joined back in 2017. It's been really fun to see kind of how our areas of interest have shifted and evolved. Because kind of like I alluded to, like our fund one, which was like a $30 million fund that was raised before I even started. It was, if you go back and look at our fund one companies, they're mostly hardware companies.
Yeah, I feel like that's something I've seen consistently throughout kind of Root's history.
Yeah, and I think we've established like a strong reputation in the hardware space. But then by the time you got to Fund 2, we brought on Lee Edwards, who does all of our pure software and enterprise software investments. And we've done more and more into that and what I would call software-enabled hardware. So it's like we still look at hardware, but a bigger portion is like pure software. And now Fund 3, we're starting to look at more and more in the climate tech, space tech, and even biotech spaces. Some of the most recent deals that I've done and I've gotten really excited about have been biotech deals, which is really exciting for me because I'm realizing that there's so much low-hanging fruit in this space. And like some of the core infrastructure is just like so broken and so outdated that I'm excited to like bring the common tools that engineers use into that world as well.
To help like kind of level that up. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I was gonna, a few things that you've said made me curious when it comes to working. This is something we've talked a lot about kind of in some of the work we do at Design Lab and how we support our community. And in thinking about engineers that are working on products, and you saying, you know, a few times that you primarily your engineers working with other engineers. And I think there's some common challenges because engineers want to work on the tech, and that's not everything that makes a business successful, right?
Correct.
So I'd love to hear kind of, if you don't mind, summarizing what would you say are some of the top challenges that you all really support engineers through? And then how do you go about, I don't know, is it just immediately kind of building out the team for those other roles or any pro tips for engineers who are terrified of dealing with all that other stuff, you know?
Well, I mean, you're probably not gonna like this answer, but engineers that are terrified of all that other stuff, they probably aren't the best like founders and CEOs for a company. And I think that I've seen the trap far too often that I like to care to admit of like really technical founders that are working on amazing products that like it's hard for me as like an engineer to not get excited about what they're working on. I'm like, this is the coolest stuff I've seen. But all they want to do is focus on the tech and have a really hard time like pulling their head up to think big picture strategy, go to market, who our customers are, how we're selling to them, how we're going to reach them. And it's like that, and how we're going to grow the team and like what order and sequence we're going to grow the team. And I think that like there is such a thing as a too technical founder. And it's okay to have a technical founder like that if they have a co-founder and a counterbalance that they deeply trust. And this might be like this might be a little bit of a controversial opinion, but I think it's really hard for like two co-founders to come in from like completely different places that had never worked together before and have that level of like trust and a commitment that they need, because there's always going to be issues. It's always going to be a rocky path and emotions and a struggle. And I think that like, you know, having co-founders that are not excited about customer discovery and those types of things is always a little bit of a yellow. Yeah, it's always a little bit of a yellow flag to me. No, it is.
Yeah. That's interesting to hear too, because I have, you know, attended some kind of startup events and things where I've heard kind of professionals in the space say like, you go find your co-founder, you know, in a way that it's like, it sounds less kind of crucial and serious to what you're saying about how like there needs to be that rapport and that relationship. So I think that's important for people to hear, because it might be a little different than some of the just like stuff that gets thrown out there. Like, you got to find a co-founder that balances your skills and all these things, but it's like, it's a really emotional relationship. And so that trust and what you're saying, I think is important to emphasize.
Right. And I'd say that like, if you look at the vast majority of our portfolio companies and the vast majority of our founding teams, it's, I don't know that we've ever funded a founder where we were like, okay, they immediately need to find a business person. Right. Because usually if they don't have some core interest, and I'm not saying they have to know it inside and out. We don't fund people that are coming right out of business school. More often than not, they're PhDs and like, you know, technical disciplines. Like, people can figure that out, but there has to be this like intrinsic motivation and excitement to learn those things, and to go figure it out.
Okay, got it. No, that makes sense. It's an important differentiation. So when it comes to some of the tech, you know, you guys are investing in right now, and that kind of everybody's just talking about these days, for example, AI, and AI across like so many disciplines. So we don't have to be discipline specific, but what do you kind of like sick of hearing, you know, when it comes to the buzz around AI? Because I think, you know, everyone wants to have an opinion. It made its waves also just even in social media and all these different places. But I'd love to hear, what are you kind of sick of? And then what are you actually most excited about when it comes to this technology?
Yeah, in terms of what I'm sick of, okay, I have so many answers to this. No, I mean, the first is like, I'm a little bit unnerved by the number of like AI funds that are popping up. The truth is, like, we've been investing in AI since 2015, right?
She's like, we've been knowing that this was the future. Yeah.
So many of our companies, if you look back at our entire portfolio, so many of them are like using AI in some like form and fashion. And then the other thing that I'd say, like, I'm a little bit sick of or turned off on is like people that think if you just throw AI for fill in the blank in front of anything, that you'll be able to
another buzzword.
That you'll be able to raise money. And I think the truth is, like, just because AI exists doesn't mean that you should throw it at every single problem. Like, first and foremost, you have to be solving a real problem for a real person that is then willing to pay you to solve said problem for them, right? And like, if that doesn't exist, it doesn't matter if you're using ChatGPT or like something else under the hood. Like, what really matters is that you're solving a real problem. And like, a lot of times the AI and the generative AI is like a means to an end to get there. But if the problem isn't real, and if it isn't severe enough that people would pay you for it to solve it, then it doesn't matter. It's almost irrelevant what the tech is. But to kind of like flip that on its head a little bit, like, what am I excited about? I think I really do. Yes, like, it can feel like we're in a little bit of a hype cycle. And if you look at the amount of capital that is going into generative AI right now, it's enormous sums of money. But I think the hype is real. Like, I really believe that like we are at this big inflection point. And just like the maturity of large language models, it's gotten almost commoditized to a point that, you know, ChatGPT and Stable Diffusion and everything in that vein has gotten commoditized and like easier and easier to use. That the thing that I'm most excited about is founders that maybe aren't, you know, experts and have PhDs in machine learning from Stanford, or maybe don't have like, you know, deep experience with building and training their own large language models, but that are now able to use the core technology and use it to apply to a problem that is like very specific to an industry that they deeply understand and that they know incredibly well. So a lot of the you know, companies that I'm looking at these days are like people who are applying like those types of technologies and AI in varying shapes and sizes to really specific problems in really specific industries. And that is what I'm most excited about at the end of the day.
That sounds awesome. Yeah. And like you said, it goes back to there being a problem to fix and that really being at the core of their solution or what they're trying to develop. Do you have an example of that?
Yeah. So I think I talked about
the PCB.
Yeah. Like the Quilter, which is doing generative AI for PCB layout. We invested in Oma Fertility that is doing AI for IVF and fertility treatments. And then we've also invested in a company called Adept, which is a generalized AI platform built by David Long, who's of OpenAI fame, right? So it's like we've got lots of bets in the AI space across a lot of different like industries and sectors and verticals, and are always looking for more But I think that
the call out there.
Yeah, I mean, please, anybody, please come to me. But I think the interesting thing right now is that as we see this, like, you know, all this hype and all these investors that maybe weren't looking at it as deeply before, like kind of like flock to the space, like valuations have become pretty inflated. People are able to get a lot more money at a lot higher valuation. And back to what we were talking about before with like the 2021
is the tech really there?
It doesn't mean that they should go out and raise all this capital just because they have access to it. Like I think putting one foot in front of the other and raising an appropriate amount, like commensurate with like where you are in terms of your product development cycle and like determining product market fit, that is the most important thing.
Absolutely.
In my mind.
Absolutely. Have you seen any of that in the space? I was going to say the space, but you can't say that. It's like space. In the space field.
Yeah, no, we've definitely seen a lot of that, and we're excited to look at more and more space deals. So much so that my partner Emily, she actually came from SpaceX, so she looks at all of our space related deals. And we did one in a company called Cayenne Space, and they're basically building collision avoidance software, because if you look at the amount of space debris that exists now, it's a lot more than it was a few years ago. And if you fast forward a few years, it's going to be like exponentially worse than it is
now
today.
There's going to be all these companies that are contributing to the whole the environment, the ecosystem around just the things that people are sending into space. Wow.
Yeah. You got to imagine
There's
a world where
world we need to think about there.
Yeah, every single person launching a satellite is going to have some sort of collision avoidance like system and software to be able to like successfully navigate around those things. And are they all going to build that in-house?
My head around.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking to Interorbital actually in a few weeks. And then also I mentioned relativity. So it's really interesting to see kind of all that's going on across the board, you know, whether it's like Interorbital, I feel like is doing a lot with students. Obviously, I'll learn more even after our interview, but these satellites with students getting kind of an introduction, I think, to sending things to space and engineering around that. Relativity obviously is making huge waves in the metal 3D printing.
Yes.
Their rockets and all that they're doing. They have a launch coming up, I believe, like next week. I don't know if by the time we get this episode out, it'll be as relevant, but
you've got a good lineup. That's really exciting.
Definitely. I'm like, I want to talk to all the folks you just mentioned too, but also we spoke with someone at NASA JPL and we were kind of talking about, you know, this relationship because it's so expensive to send stuff to space. There's all of this collaboration that happens, you know, between private and public entities. And it's interesting to think now, like what you're saying about kind of all the supporting tech that's going to help with all these missions and kind of sustain, you know, this growing other world or ecosystem. That's really exciting.
And it's
to
been
think
amazing.
About. Yeah.
It's been amazing to see how dramatically, I was working on satellites right out of undergrad, like, you know, almost 20 years ago. And it's been amazing to see how
full circle.
How quickly the costs have come down, how dramatically the costs have come down, which is really exciting. Like, it's really exciting from my perspective, because you're just going to have more and more people launching more and more things into space, and like building the core infrastructure pieces to enable people to do that, I think is really powerful.
Definitely. No, that's so exciting. Yeah. I think we could go on and on, you know, kind of discussing all the different fields that you're investing in and the exciting companies. I'm hoping that we'll be able to do, you know, follow-ups in a way that we're actually reaching out to some of these companies and doing more interviews, because it's so great to learn about Allspice from Valentina herself and, you know, more folks in some of these spaces we discussed. So I'll save some of that for, hopefully I'll tease some future episodes and get you hooked to intro me to all those people.
I will.
But I'd love to just round out with a few, I guess, more kind of rapid fire questions.
Sure.
Because I do know we're almost out of time here, and I really appreciate, you know, you taking the time. I know you're very busy. So one of my questions was, what would you say is kind of the most unexpected, satisfying thing about being in venture capital?
Yeah, the thing that I didn't expect and I didn't realize is that like you can learn so much about dramatically different industries and dramatically different products and technologies in like such a rapid fire way. Like I can be on a call talking about like engineering tools, and then the next hour being talking about, you know, the fertility industry, and then the next hour talking about the fishing industry
Keeps
and the fashion industry. And like, it's like, you know, one thing after another. And I can't think of another job where like you get paid to learn as much as you can from like top experts in the field. The last company that I diligenced was a biotech company, and like I spoke on the phone to like the former head of strategy at Moderna and one of the inventors of CRISPR. It's like, how so cool awesome. Is that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of my favorite parts of my job is that I get to speak with so many different people that are passionate about what they're working on, you know, and again, kind of get introduced to all different kinds of technology, businesses, everything in between. So I can totally relate to that.
I love it.
And when it comes to, I mean, you kind of mentioned it. I was going to say, what's kind of your pro tip for learning, you know, some of this highly technical stuff so quickly, but it sounds like you get to just like reach out to experts, which is awesome. I mean, that's my favorite way to learn. So I was do you have a podcast or book or favorite, you know, outlet? But you're like, I just call the person up on the phone and learn from them directly.
And people, you'd be surprised. Like people are, I think, you know, inherently want to be helpful. So if you can get the right contacts, like most of the battle is getting to the right people. But like, if you get to the right people, then like, I can't count the number of times that I've called in a favor and had someone like hop on the phone with me for just like 30 minutes or 45 minutes and share
such a huge
like
difference.
A total brain dump on their field and their industry or their technology. And that to me is like part of like one of the most exciting parts of this job.
Yeah. No, that's so great. And then something I was curious about, it made me think of this, what you were saying about kind of your experience at Pearl, but then also talking through like the founders that you said have maybe been too technical to take on or things like that. When do you kind of, this is kind of a bummer question. I shouldn't make such a lead up, but like, when do you guys kind of know to, I don't know what the best way to put it, kind of phase out a company, like if it's not going well?
Oh, you mean that we've already invested in? Ooh, that's a really...
Have you had to do that? And if so, how do you, how does that go, you know?
Yeah, I have had
when you decide it's like, because you said, you know, you guys put a lot into each company. You're more kind of quality over quantity as far as your strategy. So,
I mean, shutting down a company or winding things down is never fun. It's always an emotional journey, whether you're like on the founding team, whether you're an employee, whether you're an investor. It's always like a really like emotional thing. But I think that like having been through it, like, I mean, I've been in venture for 6 years now or almost 7 years now, and I haven't had to do it too many times, like knock on wood. But I think having gone through it myself, like I viscerally like know what it's like and know the motions, and I hate to say it, but like part therapist for the founders, like as we go through that process.
Yeah. And I guess I can imagine it's probably helpful. Obviously, maybe not right in the moment feels like much of a consolation, but like it's probably helpful to hear that you know, went through it and it's not the end, you know, it's not the end of the world. There is, you know, more after that. But yeah, I can imagine that's got to be tough.
So that's
tough part of the job.
Least favorite part.
Yeah, I bet. Okay. And then our finale questions that we ask all of our guests on the show. What is one thing in tech that's inspiring you right now?
Yeah, right now, the thing that I'm like most excited or inspired by is I'd say like the intersection of AI plus automation plus healthcare. I think, you know, I kind of mentioned this before, but like there's a lot of low hanging fruit in the healthcare space. And I think that not only is there low hanging fruit and potential applications for technology, but like potential applications that could move the needle in a really, really big way and impact a lot of people. And I'm really deep. I'm going off on a tangent, reading a bunch of books about cell biology right now. And like I'm really like starting to dig in on like genetics and disease and the human body. And those are the areas that I think are like really exciting for me to learn more about and continue to dig in on.
Awesome. And then what would you say is one thing outside of tech that you're inspired by these days?
Yeah. Just like in general, being outdoors. Like I live down in Santa Cruz, and there's like something about being out in nature or sitting by the ocean that's like really deeply, deeply inspiring for me. And then we've also had like recently like big rounds of storms move through and kind of, crumbling roads and like, destroying buildings and infrastructure. And I think it's been really inspiring to see like how the community has kind of come together and rallied around that.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So like those are things that I think outside of work and outside of tech that like I'm spending my time thinking about.
Definitely. Okay. And then last but not least, what is on your personal bill of materials?
Yeah, this is my favorite question. But my own personal bomb is entirely dominated by my children these days. So I've got a 4.5-year-old and then 2-year-old identical twins.
Such an exciting time.
All girls. and I describe like my time at Apple as like very intense, and I thought that like all the sleepless nights would have primed me well for like being a parent. But my God, these girls are like giving me a run for my money. Like this is like next level intense. So I'm trying to teach my 4.5-year-old to solder. She's like,
oh, that's so fun.
Slowly learning how to hold a soldering iron.
So awesome.
We're getting there. But yeah, I'm breeding the next generation of female engineers.
Love it. Single-handedly taking it all on. No, that's so great. And I was going to say one of my other questions earlier that we didn't have time for, but you kind of answered it in that answer is, how do you stay kind of hands-on? Because I know you're an engineer at heart. Obviously, you get to do some of that stuff. A lot of it's still on the job, it sounds like, but really getting to get your hands dirty and prototype stuff and build. It sounds like you're going to get to do a lot of that, plenty of that with your girls. So that's
the
great.
List of projects is a lot longer than I have to
I have a curriculum for the next, 20 years of their lives. So stay busy. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for the time today, Chrissy. It's really awesome to get kind of behind the scenes view at what you guys are doing at Root. Some pro tips for any engineers, future entrepreneurs out there that might be interested in learning more about you all, and excited to see what's on the horizon for you all, and definitely get in touch with more of your founders. So Sweet. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Chrissy, for sharing your expertise with us today. We can't wait to see what other companies Root Venture invests in and how AI and space technology change in the coming years. I highly recommend checking out the Root Ventures website. Not only can you see their amazing portfolio and the companies they've already invested in, it's also just a fun little time capsule and refreshing switch up from the usual tech websites. It's a great time, and we'll link it in the show notes. Thanks everyone for listening. If you like The Bomb, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and share the show wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow Supplyframe and Hackaday on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Design Lab at Supplyframe Design Lab on Instagram and Twitter. The Bomb is a Supplyframe podcast produced by me, Magenta Strongheart, and Ryan Tillotson. Written by Maggie Bowles and edited by Daniel Ferreira. Theme music is by Anna Hogbin, show art by Thomas Schneider, special thanks to Giovanni Salinas, Bruce Dominguez, Thomas Woodward, Jin Kumar, Jordan Clark, the entire Supplyframe team, and you, our wonderful listeners. I'm your host, Magenta Strongheart. See you next week.